I can still hear the church bells that morning, slow and heavy, as though the whole world had decided to mourn with me. The air was sharp with cold, yet I hardly felt it. My fingers clutched the black veil that trembled against my skin, not because of the wind, but because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. They say time stops at funerals, but for me it was moving cruelly fast, dragging me into a future I didn't want. I had lost my husband and my partner of 47 years, the man who carried bricks with his bare hands to build the house we both called our fortress, the man who whispered promises into my ears when we had nothing but dreams. And now all I had left of him was a coffin, draped in flowers, while my heart broke into pieces too sharp to hold. I thought grief would be the heaviest burden I carried that day, but I was wrong. As the priest's voice rose, my son leaned toward me. At first I thought he would whisper words of comfort, something like, "It's okay, Mom," or "We'll take care of you now." That's what children say, isn't it? That's what sons are supposed to say when their father is lowered into the ground. But his breath brushed my ear, and his words froze me colder than the grave itself. "Now sell the house, Grandma. We need the money." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My body stiffened, my throat dried, and my eyes darted to his face, hoping he had meant something else, anything else. But no, his gaze was steady, impatient, already calculating. While my husband's body hadn't even touched the soil, my son was already burying me alive with his greed. I couldn't breathe. Around me, mourners wept, tissues pressed to red eyes, their sobs echoing against the church walls. And yet, in my ears, all I heard was his whisper replaying, clawing inside my head. Sell the house. That house wasn't just bricks and paint. It was my life's work, the place where I had raised him, fed him, sacrificed sleep for him, carried debts for him. Every crack in those walls had a story. Every corner carried a piece of me. And yet, to him, it was only numbers, only money. My husband's coffin looked lighter than the weight that pressed on my chest at that moment. I gripped the wooden pew until my knuckles whitened, trying to hold on to myself, to the fragments of dignity that hadn't yet been shattered. But as the priest spoke about eternal rest and everlasting peace, I realized something far more terrible. My husband's rest was eternal, but mine was just beginning to be disturbed. My son had not spoken out of desperation. Number. His tone was too smooth, too certain, too rehearsed. It was as though he had been waiting for this very moment, as though the funeral wasn't just his father's farewell, but the opening act of something darker. I wanted to scream, to demand how he could be so heartless, but the lump in my throat silenced me. Instead, I turned my face away, hiding behind the veil, hiding the tears that weren't only for my husband anymore, but for the child I no longer recognized. The boy who once clutched my skirts when thunder frightened him was gone. The man beside me was a stranger, and his whisper had turned my grief into fear. Because if my son could say such words here, in this sacred place, in this sacred moment, then what else was he capable of? What was already planned behind my back? I sat there motionless, my heart torn between mourning the man I loved and dreading the future my own son seemed determined to carve out of my pain. The coffin hadn't yet left the altar, and already I knew this funeral was not the end. It was the beginning of a story I never wanted to live, a story in which I was not only a widow, but prey in the eyes of the very blood I gave life to. When the service ended and people began to shuffle outside, I stayed seated, frozen in that wooden pew. My son had already stepped away, shaking hands with distant relatives and nodding politely, his face wearing the perfect mask of a grieving son. Nobody would guess what he had just whispered into my ear moments ago. They would see a man in a black suit, sorrow carved across his forehead, eyes lowered in respect. They would never know that behind that mask was hunger, not for comfort, not for love, but for money, my money, our home, my life's only anchor, and for the first time in 70 years of living, I felt like a stranger among my own blood. People came to me, one after another, offering their condolences, their murmurs of "stay strong" and "he's in a better place now." I nodded. I forced a weak smile, but their words barely reached me. My ears were still echoing with that one whisper like a splinter in my heart. I thought of how my husband used to place his strong hand on mine in moments like this. He had been my shield, my comfort, the reason I could face storms without fear. But he wasn't here anymore. He was lying in a box, silent, unable to protect me from what was now unfolding. And sitting there, I realized the cruel truth. It was not death that had left me most vulnerable. It was the living. Later, as we walked slowly behind the coffin out to the cemetery, I watched my son from behind. His shoulders looked broad, confident, even proud. I remembered those shoulders when they were small, when he was a boy who would ride on his father's back, laughing with the freedom only children know. I remembered nights when he was sick with fever and I pressed wet cloths to his forehead, praying through tears for his life. I remembered the day he graduated, the day I thought, this is the moment all our sacrifices were for. His father and I had worked double shifts, skipped meals, even sold the little gold I owned to pay for his education. Every pain, every struggle, we told ourselves, was worth it if our son would stand tall, if he would never have to know the hunger we knew. And now, as I followed his steps to his father's grave, I couldn't help but wonder, was this what we raised him for? For this coldness? For this betrayal? At the graveside the air grew heavier, the coffin was lowered, the ropes creaking like the very threads of my life breaking. I clutched a single rose, its petals trembling as much as my hand, and I let it fall. The sound of the thud when it hit the wood inside still rings in my ears. Around me, sobs rose, prayers filled the air, and I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet. But before I could even catch my breath, before I could even whisper my final goodbye, I felt a hand on my arm. It was my son again, leaning close, his voice low, steady, almost businesslike. "You know we can't keep the house now. Dad is gone. We need to move fast." The ground could have swallowed me whole, and I would have felt less shock than in that moment. "Move fast," I whispered back, my voice breaking. He didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted towards the coffin, then back at me. "The bills are piling up. The mortgage, the taxes. We can't afford it. Just sell it, Mom. It's just a house. Just a house." My knees nearly buckled. That home was where I had given birth to him, where his father and I had planted the first apple tree in the yard, where we marked his height year after year on the kitchen wall. To him it was just a house. To me it was 47 years of love, of labor, of life. But I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't asking. He was telling me. And worse, I knew then, this wasn't sudden. He had thought about this long before his father's heart stopped beating, maybe even long before his father's health had started failing. And if that was true, then what else had he been planning without me? As the priest's final words echoed, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, I stood there not only burying my husband, but watching the first shovel of dirt fall onto the trust I once had in my son. And I knew, deep in my bones, this was only the beginning, because men who whisper about houses at funerals don't stop there. They don't stop at whispers. The days after the funeral blurred into one another, but not because of grief alone. Grief I knew how to endure. I had lost parents, siblings, friends over the years. But this was different. It was not death that kept me awake at night, but the living voices of my own children echoing in my head, especially his. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. "Sell the house, Grandma. We need the money." Even when the house was silent, even when I sat in the kitchen staring at the cup of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink, the whisper clung to me like a shadow. And it wasn't long before that whisper grew into actions. On the third day after the burial, when the black ribbons still hung from the door, my son came by. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't sit with me in silence. He didn't even ask if I had eaten. He came with papers. His shoes clicked sharply on the wooden floor that still smelled of incense from the prayer gathering, and he set the folder on the table as though it were a gift. "Mom," he said with a calmness that felt like a blade, "I've already spoken to an agent. If we move quickly, we can sell before the market dips. It's the smart thing to do." I stared at the folder. It might as well have been a coffin. "You mean our house?" I whispered. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Mom, you can't live here alone. It's too big, too expensive. What's the point of holding on to it?" He flipped the papers open, pointing at figures, market values, offers I hadn't even known were made. "This is the right decision," Dad would have agreed. Those words stabbed deeper than anything else. Dad would have agreed. How dare he put those words in the mouth of the man who had poured every drop of sweat into these walls. My husband, who used to say, "This house is for you, for us, for when we're old and need shelter." My husband, who promised me that no matter what storms came, these four walls would keep us safe. And now our son was using his father's memory as a weapon against me. As he spoke, my mind drifted back to the early days, when the house was nothing but a patch of land and a pile of bricks. I remembered carrying buckets of water with my own hands to mix cement, while he, my husband, laid down brick after brick, singing softly under his breath. I remembered sleeping on the floor with only a blanket when the roof wasn't finished, because we couldn't afford rent elsewhere. I remembered patching leaks with my bare hands, working night shifts just to buy a second-hand door to keep us warm. And through it all, our son had grown under that roof, running in the garden, scribbling homework on the kitchen table, bringing friends over who envied how homey our little place was. He had lived in every drop of sacrifice we gave, and now that history was reduced to a smart decision on paper. I pushed the folder back toward him, my voice shaking but firm. "I'm not selling." His jaw tightened. He leaned closer, his voice lower, colder. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You can't keep it. It's not practical." And frankly, he paused, almost as if he were choosing whether to cut me deeper, then said it anyway. "We need the money more than you need the house." The silence that followed was louder than any shout could have been. I stared at him, at this man who once held my hand at night when nightmares chased him, at this son who once told me I was the best mother in the world, and in that silence I realized something that made my stomach twist. He had been waiting. My husband's death wasn't just a tragedy to him, it was an opportunity, and if he had come this far, placing papers on my table before the flowers on the grave had even wilted, what else was he willing to do? I didn't answer him. I simply closed the folder, stood, and walked away. But even as I did, I knew he wasn't finished. Men like that, men whose eyes see dollar signs where their hearts should be, they don't stop at a no. And I feared that my son, my own flesh and blood, was just beginning his campaign to strip me of the only thing I had left. It didn't take long for my son to return. This time he didn't come alone. A week after the funeral, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I peeked through the lace curtains, I saw him step out with his wife, her heels clicking arrogantly against the stones. She was dressed as though she were going to a luncheon, not visiting her grieving mother-in-law, and she carried no food, no flowers, not even a polite smile. Instead, she clutched a large purse, the kind that could swallow papers whole, and the sight of it made my stomach tighten. I knew before they even rang the bell that they weren't here to comfort me. They were here to corner me. When I opened the door, my daughter-in-law didn't bother with the usual niceties. She stepped inside as though she owned the place, her eyes sweeping across the living room with a gaze that wasn't sentimental, but appraising, like a buyer checking furniture at an auction. "You know this house could fetch more than what the agent quoted," she said, running her manicured fingers along the mantelpiece. "If you sell fast, you'll get a clean profit. But if you wait, well, the market can be cruel." Her words cut sharper than her tone. She didn't even attempt to disguise it as concern. To her, my home wasn't memories, wasn't sacrifice. It was an asset, a commodity, a prize to be won. My son followed her in, silent at first, letting her do the talking. He had always been like that in his marriage, letting her voice push through when he lacked the courage to speak the ugliness himself. She turned to me then, her smile thin, her eyes cold. "It's too big for you anyway. Why hold on to it? You should be practical, Mother. Think of us. Think of the family." "The family?" I nearly laughed, bitterly, right in her face. "Which family? The one that had left me alone to bury my husband in grief? The one that whispered about osses while the coffin was still open? The one whose only visits came with folders and agents and papers?" But my throat was tight, and the laughter stayed locked behind my teeth. Instead, I looked at my son, hoping, begging silently for a glimpse of the boy I once knew. But his face was stone, his eyes averted, and when he finally spoke, his words shattered what little hope I had left. "Mum, she's right. This is what Dad would want, to help us, to give us a future, as though I hadn't already given him one, as though my husband and I hadn't bled and broken ourselves to ensure he had more than we ever did. I thought of all those nights when my husband came home with cracked hands from the factory, how I sewed clothes until my eyes burned, how we skipped meals just so our son could wear new shoes to school. Every sacrifice had been made for his future, and now, with his father barely a week in the ground, he had the audacity to stand in my house and demand more. They slid papers across the table again. "Just sign," she said softly, but there was steel in her voice. "It's better for everyone." My hand trembled, not from age, but from rage. I didn't touch the pen. Instead, I stood, my voice firmer than I thought possible. "This house is not for sale." The silence that followed was suffocating. My daughter-in-law's smile dropped, her eyes flashing. My son's jaw clenched, his hand curling into a fist at his side. For a moment I thought he might shout, but instead he simply gathered the papers, shoved them back into the folder, and said words that sent a chill down my spine. "You'll regret this, Mom. Don't make us do this the hard way." The hard way. The words lingered long after they left, their car tires crunching on the gravel. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me, the chair where my husband used to sit, sipping tea, smiling at me with those gentle eyes. I whispered into the silence, "What do I do now, Robert?" Because I knew this wasn't over. Number. This was only the beginning of a storm I wasn't sure I was strong enough to survive. The house was never the same after that visit. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an echo of their footsteps. Every corner seemed to whisper the threat they had left behind. The hard way. I couldn't sit in my favourite chair by the window without imagining strangers standing there with clipboards, measuring curtains, planning renovations for a house I was still breathing in. Nights became the worst. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing my husband's voice in my memory. "This house will keep you safe when I'm gone." But now I didn't feel safe. Not with my own son circling like a wolf outside the door. And soon the signs began to show. Letters started arriving, not in my name but in his. Offers, estimates, contracts with strange signatures scribbled across the bottom. I knew then he wasn't just talking about selling the house. He was already moving pieces behind my back, setting things in motion as if the decision had already been made. I confronted him over the phone once, my voice trembling as I asked, "Why are these papers coming here?" His reply was cold, dismissive, like I was an old woman rambling nonsense. "Mum, you must be mistaken. Maybe it's just junk mail." But I could hear the lie in his voice. The silence after was worse than words. One afternoon I caught sight of my daughter-in-law through the lace curtain. She was standing outside near the gate with a man in a crisp suit, pointing toward the house, gesturing at the roof, the yard, the garden, my garden, the one where I had planted roses every spring, with hands that still smelled of earth. I pressed a hand to my chest, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to run outside, to scream at them, but my body wouldn't move. Instead, I watched from behind the curtain like a prisoner peeking at the world through bars. When the man left, she stayed a moment longer, staring at the house with a look that wasn't admiration but ownership. She smiled, a smile that made me shiver, then got into her car and drove away. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder they had left before, the one I hadn't signed. I wanted to burn it, to set it on fire and watch the ashes drift, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the sense that this paper was more powerful than I understood. And deep down, I knew. If they had already begun showing the house to strangers, then somewhere, somehow, they had found a way to make their plans legal. The thought gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone and called an old family friend, Samuel, my husband's companion from his factory days, a man who had known us since before the house was even built. When he answered, I couldn't hold back the tears. "Samuel," I whispered, "I think they're trying to take my house." His voice, gruff but kind, steadied me. "Calm down, Renata. Tell me everything," and I did. The whispers at the funeral, the papers, the threats, the strangers. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said words that chilled me more than anything yet. "You need to be careful. If they've already started showing the house, that means they've put things in motion you don't know about. You must check if they've forged your name." Forged my name. The very thought made my skin crawl. I looked at my trembling hands and remembered all the times those same hands had signed checks to pay his tuition, to buy him new shoes, to keep food on his plate. And now those hands might be betrayed by ink I never laid down. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside felt like footsteps coming for me. And when the morning light seeped through the curtains, I realized something terrifying. My battle was no longer just against grief or loneliness or even betrayal. It was against my own blood, armed with papers and lies, willing to strip me of everything I had left. And though my husband's grave was still fresh, I knew the fight for my own survival had already begun. Samuel came by the next day, his old frame leaning on a cane, his eyes sharp, despite the wrinkles carved deep into his face. He had always been a man of quiet dignity, the kind who spoke little but saw everything. When he stepped into the house, he didn't need me to explain the weight in the air. He felt it. He sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands folded, and said simply, "Show me the papers." I slid the folder across, my fingers trembling as I did. He pulled out his spectacles, adjusted them, and began flipping through each page with the kind of care my own son hadn't shown me in years. Minutes passed, his brows furrowing deeper with every turn. Finally, he set the papers down, his jaw tight. "Renata," he said, his voice heavy, "these aren't drafts. These are agreements, contracts, and..." He tapped one page with his finger, his eyes meeting mine. "That's your signature." I froze. My signature. My hands curled against the table, cold sweat breaking across my neck. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I never signed anything." He pushed the page closer. There it was. My name, written in the same cursive I had used 1,000 times before. But the loops were wrong, the slant uneven. I knew my own writing like I knew the lines on my palms, and that was not mine. Samuel leaned closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves were listening. "They've forged it, Renata. They're moving ahead as though the house is already theirs. Look here." He pointed at dates, signatures, agent stamps. "They've lined up buyers. This isn't a plan. This is an operation. My stomach churned, the room spinning around me. My son, my own flesh and blood. He had not only whispered greed at his father's grave, but had carried it out, pen strokes pretending to be mine, betraying the trust of the woman who gave him life. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I pressed a hand to my chest, whispering, how could he do this to me? Samuel's face softened, but his eyes stayed fierce. Because you made it too easy for him, he said gently. You gave him everything. You never let him feel hunger, never let him see you break. He thinks sacrifice is free. He doesn't know what it costs. His words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had shielded my son from pain his whole life, and in doing so, I had raised a man who thought nothing of inflicting it on me. I felt tears spill over, dripping onto the papers that lay like poison between us. What do I do now, Samuel? He's my son. My voice cracked. He's all I have left. Samuel reached across, placing his rough hand over mine. No, Renata, you are all you have left, and if you don't fight, they'll strip you of everything, even your dignity. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. For years I had lived for my family, for my husband, for my son. I had given everything I had, believing love would be returned in kind. But staring at those forged papers, I realized something terrible. Love wasn't enough for them, not anymore. They wanted power, they wanted possession, and they wouldn't stop until they had it. That night, I sat alone by the window, the house, quiet but my mind roaring. Outside, the garden my husband had tended for decades swayed in the wind, the roses bowing their heads as though mourning with me. And as I stared into the dark, one thought gripped me so tightly I could not shake it. If they could forge my name once, what else were they capable of forging? My will, my bank accounts, my very identity? The whisper at the funeral had been just the beginning. The battle ahead was far darker than I had imagined. I didn't have to wait long before the storm broke. 2 evenings later, there was a knock at the door. Firm, impatient, the kind of knock that doesn't ask for permission but demands surrender. My heart tightened. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, there stood my son, no longer wearing the mask of a grieving child. His face was hard, his eyes sharp, and in his hand was another folder, thicker than the last. He didn't wait to be invited in. He stepped inside, his shoes leaving dirt on the floorboards, and dropped the folder on the table with a loud slap. "Mum," he said, his tone clipped, "we need to finalize this. Enough of the games." I stood frozen, clutching the edge of the chair for balance. "Games," I whispered. "This is my home, the one your father and I built with our hands, the one where you were raised." His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. This isn't just about you anymore. This house is wasted. It could be worth so much, and we need that money now. My debts are piling up. Do you know what happens when you can't pay? Do you know what it's like to be hounded by collectors?" He slammed his fist onto the table, making the teacups rattle. "You don't, because you've never had to worry. You've been sitting here in this house while I'm drowning." The words struck me like blows, each one sharper than the last. Drowning? I wanted to scream that I had drowned every day of my youth, working until my fingers bled so he could stay afloat. I wanted to shout that I had been the one scraping pennies together so he could eat, so he could study, so he could live a life free from hunger and fear. But my voice betrayed me. Only one word slipped out, hoarse and trembling. "Debts." He looked away, jaw tight, and in that silence I saw the truth. He hadn't just wanted the house out of convenience. He had already gambled away his own future, and now he was here to gamble with mine. "I've already spoken to people," he continued coldly. "This deal is happening. The papers are ready. If you don't sign, then I'll—" He stopped himself, his fists clenching at his sides, his breath heavy with rage. "Don't push me, Mom. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." For the first time in my life, I saw something in my son's eyes that terrified me. Not disappointment, not anger, but emptiness. A hollow place where love should have been. My knees weakened, and I sank into the chair, staring at the son I had raised, the boy I had fed and clothed, the man who now stood before me as my enemy. He shoved the folder toward me again. "Sign it." His voice was no longer a request. It was a command. "Sign it, and this will all be over." I looked down at the papers, my own forged signature staring back at me, mocking me. My hands trembled, my chest heaving, but still I shook my head. No, my voice cracked, but it was steady enough. I will not sign away my life. The silence that followed stretched like a blade between us. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, and finally he spat out words that cut deeper than any knife. "Then don't blame me for what happens next." He turned and left, the slam of the door reverberating through the house, shaking the very walls my husband had built. I sat there in the silence, my breath shallow, my heart pounding, and for the first time I realized the truth. This was no longer about whispers or papers or debts. My own son was willing to destroy me if it meant saving himself, and I was no longer safe in the house I had once called home. The days after his outburst felt like walking through a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Every knock at the door made me jump. Every phone call sent my heart racing. I no longer felt like the owner of my house. I felt like a guest waiting to be thrown out, and soon enough the signs of his threats became impossible to ignore. First the mail. Envelopes began arriving with strange company names, bank stamps, and notices about property transfers. Some bore my name, typed neatly across the top, but the contents spoke as though I had already agreed to everything. Words like finalization, closing date, confirmation of sale screamed at me in black ink. My hands trembled so badly I dropped one envelope into my teacup, watching the ink blur, as though the truth itself was drowning before my eyes. Then came the strangers, men I didn't recognize walking slowly along the sidewalk, their eyes sliding toward my windows, my yard, the roof above my head. One even came up the steps, clipboard in hand, knocking as though it were his right. "I'm here to check the property before closing," he said, his smile thin. I stared at him through the half-open door, the chain still locked in place. "There is no closing," I whispered. "This is my house." He frowned, glanced at his clipboard, and muttered something about confusion before leaving. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't confused. He was certain that this house no longer belonged to me. That night, I called Samuel again, my voice shaking as I described the letters, the men, the knocking at the door. He listened patiently, then said in a low voice, "Renata, they're moving fast. Your son isn't just bluffing. He's already treating this house as if it's his. If they've forged your signature once, they can push through anything. You need proof, something to show the courts." "The courts?" I asked, my chest tightening. The thought of dragging my own son before strangers, of standing in a courtroom against the child I had once rocked to sleep, made bile rise in my throat. But Samuel's next words cut through my hesitation. "If you don't, you'll wake up one morning and find locks on your own doors, and then it will be too late." Sleep became impossible after that. I wandered the house at night, running my fingers along the walls, touching the furniture, whispering to the silence as if my husband could hear me. "Robert, what would you do? How do I fight our own son?" The air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the very house was holding its breath. And then one evening I saw them again, my son and his wife, standing at the edge of the yard, speaking to another couple I had never seen before. They pointed to the house, gestured at the windows, the roof, the garden. The couple nodded, smiling, as if admiring something already theirs. I pressed my hand against the glass of the window, my breath fogging it up, and in that moment I realized the terrible truth. They weren't just planning, they were already selling. While I was still alive, still breathing in this house, they were walking strangers through my memories, pricing every corner of my life. I sank into my chair, tears burning down my cheeks. It was then I understood fully, this wasn't just greed, it wasn't just debt. My son had chosen to erase me before I was even gone, and unless I did something soon, the house my husband and I had built with sweat and love would be taken from me, brick by brick, memory by memory, until there was nothing left of us at all. The night after I saw them showing my house to strangers, I sat at the kitchen table long after the clock struck midnight, staring at the documents Samuel had helped me gather, proof of the forgery, proof of the rushed sales, copies of letters where my name had been used without my hand. My tears had dried into something else now, not grief, not fear, but resolve. For weeks I had been paralyzed, hoping my son would come to his senses, hoping the boy I once raised would return to me. But the truth was clear. The boy I loved was gone, replaced by a man who had no shame in burying his own mother alive. And if I didn't fight now, everything my husband and I had sacrificed for would be erased. The next morning, with Samuel by my side, I walked into the lawyer's office. My legs trembled, my heart hammered, but my voice was steady when I said, I need to stop my son from stealing my house. The lawyer, a young woman with sharp eyes, listened intently as I laid everything before her, the whispers, the threats, the forged signatures, the buyers walking through my yard. When I finished, she leaned back, her face grave. This isn't the first time I've seen something like this, she said, but it won't be easy. They've already pushed this far. It means they're desperate, and desperate people, they don't back down quietly. Her words rang true faster than I could have imagined. That very evening my son arrived again, this time pounding on the door so hard I feared it would splinter. I didn't open it. Instead, I stood on the other side, my heart racing, my hands shaking but my voice strong. You need to stop, I said through the wood. I know what you've done. The forgery, the buyers. I've spoken to a lawyer. For a long moment there was silence. Then his voice came, low and venomous. You think you can fight me? You think anyone will believe you over me? You're old, Mom. You don't even know what you're signing half the time. Maybe you did sign and forgot. Maybe you're just confused. The cruelty of those words almost broke me. Almost. But then, from somewhere deep inside, from the same place that had once carried me through hunger, through long shifts at the factory, through nights of raising him when I had nothing but faith, I found strength. I am not confused, I said firmly. I built this house with your father. This is my home, and I will fight you with every breath left in me. There was a pause, and then he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that chilled me more than any whisper could. Fine, he spat. If it's a fight you want, it's a fight you'll get. Don't blame me when you lose everything. And with that, he stormed away, the slam of his car door echoing down the street. I stood there in the silence that followed, my body trembling, tears welling in my eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of defiance. My husband's voice seemed to rise from the walls themselves, steady and warm. You're stronger than you think, Renata. Don't let them win. And for the first time since the funeral, I believed him. I believed in me. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about my dignity, my worth, my right to exist without being erased. My son had chosen greed, but I chose to fight. The weeks that followed were a blur of court papers, tense hearings, and sleepless nights. My son came at me with every weapon he could find, lawyers, documents, accusations. He painted me as an old woman who had lost her memory, who had signed away her house, and now regretted it. He stood before strangers and called me confused, fragile, unreliable. Each word stung, not just because it was cruel, but because it came from my own flesh, my own blood. And yet, With Samuel by my side and my young lawyer guiding me, I refused to break. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom in my black dress, the same one I had worn to my husband's funeral. It wasn't just mourning attire anymore. It was armor. My son sat across the room, his wife beside him, her eyes sharp, her smile tight. For a moment, I saw the boy he had once been, the child who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street, and my heart ached. But then he looked at me with cold eyes, and I knew that boy was gone. When the forged signatures were presented, when the evidence was laid bare, the courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the truth came into focus. The documents weren't mine. The lies began to unravel. My son's face hardened, his wife's hand clutched his arm, but there was no saving him from the weight of proof. The judge's voice rang out steady and clear. This property belongs solely to Mrs. Renata. Any attempts to sell or transfer ownership without her consent are fraudulent and void. In that moment, relief washed over me, but it was not sweet. It was heavy, like the air after a storm that has torn apart the land. I had won. The house was safe. But as I looked across the room at my son, who now sat with his head bowed, his life of debts and schemes collapsing around him, I felt no triumph, only sorrow, because justice had been served, but love had been buried. When it was over, I walked out of the courtroom slowly, Samuel steadying me with his arm. The sky was grey, the wind sharp, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of peace. My husband's promise had been kept. Our house, our fortress, still stood, but the price had been higher than I ever imagined. That evening, I sat in my chair by the window, the garden bathed in twilight. The roses swayed gently, their petals trembling as though they too had survived a storm. I pressed a hand to the wall beside me, whispering softly to the empty room, "It's safe now, Robert." I kept it safe. Tears blurred my eyes, not of defeat, but of bittersweet victory. I had my home, my dignity, my strength, but I had lost my son long before the court had spoken, and as I sat there, the house, silent but alive with memories, I realized something I wished I had never had to learn. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought against strangers, but against those we once held closest. And sometimes winning does not feel like victory. It feels like survival,